Okay, welcome to our second lesson here in Module 3, Lesson 12, Unemployment. Um, in our last lesson, we learned a little bit about the overall look of the macroeconomic economy, including we talked about something called the business cycle. And we noticed that one of the things that was true about the business cycle was we tried to avoid getting too far in the business cycle into either those peaks, those things we called very high periods of expansion, or those troughs, very, very low periods of contraction in the economy. And the way to avoid doing that, the way to avoid ever having real high peaks or real low troughs, is to try to eliminate the two things that all macroeconomists are always trying to deal with. And to understand that better, I like to think of the problem of macroeconomies as this guy. We'll call him the macro monster. Now, the macro monster, as you notice, is a two-headed monster. All macroeconomists lose sleep at night worrying about these two problems. The first problem is the one we're going to be learning about in just a minute, and that is the problem of unemployment. You notice that we had in our business cycle in the last lesson, we had those very, very deep troughs where the economy was really sluggish and really wasn't doing well. When that's the case, unemployment is our big problem. And again, that's what this lesson is going to be all about today. It's worth noting that every macroeconomist also worries about the exact opposite of unemployment, something called inflation. And generally speaking, when we have those really high peaks that we talked about, that is often associated, or often what comes along with that is this thing called inflation. And as it turns out, throughout the semester, we're going to be fighting the macro monster. But the macro monster has two heads. And anytime we only fight one, we actually might be making the other one stronger. So what we're going to look at today is how do we begin to understand these two evil heads, and how do we begin to deal with them so that neither one becomes too powerful and becomes too strong. And in doing so, we make sure that the economy never gets into too high of a peak or too low of a trough. And remember, we said that was our goal from our last lesson. So today we're going to start learning about unemployment. And in the next two lessons in this module, we'll be learning a little bit about inflation. Before we can actually fight our enemy, we have to know our enemy, right? So today we start with unemployment. Well, what's unemployment all about? Well, the term is actually pretty self-explanatory, right? Unemployment is essentially when people don't have enough jobs. And you can see here that this is a classic picture from the Great Depression era where there was such high levels of unemployment. Almost 25% of our country was defined as unemployed at the highest point of the Great Depression. And you can obviously imagine that meant that an awful lot of men, an awful lot of women, and an awful lot of children needed help. You can see here they're giving out free donuts and free coffee to try to help support. But these sort of lines were not uncommon during that time period. And you can see why economists would want to try to address this problem and make sure that it never happens, or at least that it's limited when it does happen. Okay, but again, to understand it and to really fight it, we have to really know what unemployment really means. So let's start with some basics. Okay, workers in this country fall into essentially a couple of categories. The first one is the one that we're going to be addressing a lot in this unit, the unemployed. Now, there's really two parts to being unemployed. The first is that you do not have a job. That's pretty self-explanatory. If you don't have a job, no job at all, then you could be unemployed. But the other factor is you must be actively looking. So those are the two factors that must be true for someone to be counted as unemployed. Does not have a job, but is actively looking. Those two things combined make you an unemployed person. You may also be employed, and that's very simple. It means that you have a job, any job. It could mean that you're a part-time worker, that you don't have a full-time job, but you wouldn't be counted as unemployed even if you wanted to work 40 hours a week, but were only working 20 hours a week. You would still be counted as employed, not unemployed. We also sometimes talk about people that are called underemployed, people who are way overqualified for their job. So, for example, if you had a heart surgeon who was working behind a deli counter, no offense to deli counter workers, but I think it's safe to say we'd rather the heart surgeon be doing open heart surgery than working at a deli counter. But the unemployed, that person wouldn't be counted as unemployed even though clearly their skills aren't being fulfilled. So anybody who has any job at all, whether it's part-time, whether it's full-time, whether they're underemployed or not, they're considered employed. Now, these two categories together, the employed or the unemployed, they equal what's called our labor force. So when you add those two things together, the employed and the unemployed, you get the labor force. Now, there are obviously some people who don't fall into either one of these two categories, that are neither unemployed or employed. And that seems kind of strange, but think about it. Employed means you have a job. Unemployed means that you don't have a job and are actively looking. So who might not be in either one of those categories and therefore not in the labor force? Well, there's actually a number of people. Retired people are not in the labor force. Young children are not in the labor force. This is a big one. Discouraged workers, people who want work but have given up looking. This is a big deal. And these folks, even though they obviously would like jobs, are not considered unemployed or employed. They're not a part of the labor force because they aren't actively looking for work. So discouraged workers. People who are unable to work if they're disabled for some reason. Full-time students. We consider that to essentially be their career, and therefore we're not going to count them as being unemployed if they're a student. Independently wealthy people who are just sitting around enjoying life. All of those folks are not a part of the labor force, because remember, in order to be in the labor force, you have to either be employed, have a job, or be unemployed, and the key there is not having a job but actively looking. Most of these folks are not actively looking or not able to actively look, and so they are not a part of the labor force. Now that's important to consider as we do some calculations here in a minute. But first, we also want to talk about some different types of unemployment. The first type is what's called structural unemployment. And that's when jobs are available, but your skills don't match. So for example, if you need a plumber, but you have the skills to be an electrician, you probably won't get hired. So therefore, you are structurally unemployed. And this includes people, by the way, who were replaced by technology, because in a way, if you think about it, those people's skills don't match or aren't strong enough to beat out the robots. So those folks who used to collect your tolls on the highways, who have now been replaced by EasyPass, those folks don't have the ability. Those folks would be considered structurally unemployed because they don't have the ability, essentially, they don't have the skills to keep up with the robot. That category gets forgotten about a lot. So it's not just people whose jobs don't match, but it's also people who have been replaced by technology. Okay, a second category, and a very important one, is what's called frictional unemployment. And that's unemployment that's caused because someone is changing jobs. They've left one job and are moving to another job, and therefore they are considered frictionally unemployed. So if I decide to quit my job as a teacher and go and become, I don't know, a rodeo clown, the time between those two periods, I am considered frictionally unemployed. A third type of unemployment is what's called seasonal unemployment. And seasonal unemployment is pretty obvious, right? If you're a lifeguard at a lake in the Northeast, you're probably going to be unemployed come January, and vice versa. Your snowplow driver is probably going to be unemployed in the middle of August. Lastly, we have what's called cyclical unemployment, and I've put a star next to that. We'll talk about why in just a minute. But what it is unemployment caused because the economy is doing poorly. There simply isn't enough demand for goods and services to employ everyone who wants a job. And we'll talk about why that one has a star and why it's such a uniquely interesting one of all four of these. Okay, but these are the four types of unemployment that we have. Now, that brings us to a term called natural unemployment. And natural unemployment is actually a very simple concept. It's the sum of the first three types of unemployment: structural unemployment, frictional unemployment, and seasonal unemployment. And it's actually, in a way, what I call the good unemployment, believe it or not. This is the kind of unemployment we actually want. But why? Why is it good? Well, if you think about it, every economy needs some people to be unemployed. right? We wouldn't want to have for seasonal unemployment, we wouldn't want to hire the snowplow driver all year round because that means he'd be sitting around not doing anything in August, and that would be a waste of resources. With structural and frictional, structural, for example, we want technology to sometimes replace workers. It would be a little bit silly if we still had people collecting tolls when in fact this fancy system of EasyPass could collect our tolls for us. We want those people to go and do something that would be more productive. But we know that's going to take time, so we want them to move on. Same thing with frictional. We want it to be so that, for example, if jobs moved from one area to another, we don't want people to just stay employed in the area where they're not really needed. That would be a waste of resources. So we want them to be able to transition from one job to another. If the economy didn't have natural unemployment, structural, frictional, and seasonal, then we'd actually stagnate. We'd get stuck. We need these people to be unemployed so that our economy can change and move. The one we want to really avoid is cyclical unemployment. We don't want cyclical unemployment because what that means is people are unemployed not for a good reason, not because we need time for them to transition or because it would be a waste for them to be unemployed. The problem here is we have good, productive people who are not being employed because there's not enough demand for goods and services that they would produce. So ultimately, for economists, our goal is always going to be cyclical unemployment. When the president or congressman talk about fighting unemployment, they really don't mean natural unemployment. They mean specifically cyclical unemployment. And so, what is ultimately the goal of an economist? It is to reach this thing called full employment. And let's define that. It's when we produce enough goods and services to eliminate cyclical unemployment, but not so much that we cut into natural unemployment. It's a very fine balancing act, but there is this magical point at which we produce enough things that we have no one who is cyclically unemployed, but we're not beginning to pull those structurally, frictionally, and seasonally unemployed people into positions that they're not really ready for. It's a very tricky balance, and throughout the course of this semester, our goal is going to be to try to reach full employment. Okay, think of employment as like the finish line for us. That's where we want to get to, full employment. Okay, one last bit of information, and that is a piece of statistical information. It's important to remember that, and this gets confusing sometimes, when we are at full employment, it doesn't mean that we have no unemployment. We do have unemployment. We have natural unemployment. We just don't have any cyclical unemployment. And that's kind of a trick question that sometimes gets asked. Being at full employment doesn't mean having no one unemployed. It means having no one cyclically unemployed. Okay, the last thing we need to do is talk about something called the unemployment rate. And what is the unemployment rate? Well, it's actually very simple. It's a key statistic used to measure how the economy is doing. And what it is the percentage of people in the labor force that are unemployed. Let's start first by calculating or showing you how to calculate the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is equal to the number of unemployed people divided by the number of people in the labor force and then multiplied times 100% because it is a percentage. Again, it's the number of unemployed people divided by the number of people in the labor force times 100%. So why don't we start with an example? Okay, suppose the nation of Macroacondia has 100 people. 60 of them are employed, 20 of them are unemployed, and 20 are discouraged. What is Macroacondia's unemployment rate? All right, let's use our formula and get some information. Remember our formula. It's the number of people unemployed divided by the number of people in the labor force times 100%. So in this case, well, actually in all cases, remember the labor force is made up of two things. It's made up of those who are employed plus those who are unemployed. So an extended version of our formula is the number of unemployed divided by the number of employed plus unemployed times 100%. So with that information, we can do a little work. Let's see. We have 20 people that are unemployed divided by 20 people that are unemployed plus 60 people who are employed times 100%. And that would make 20 divided by 80, which means 0.25 times 100%, or 25%. So our unemployment rate in Macroecondia is 25%. All right, let's try. Why don't you try one? Suppose the nation of Econville has 75 people. 40 of them are employed, 10 of them are unemployed, 20 are retired, and 5 are discouraged. What is Econville's unemployment rate? At this point, stop the video, try this practice problem on your own. Okay, let's go ahead and see if you worked this problem out correctly. First, let's remember what our formula is to calculate the unemployment rate. It's the number of unemployed divided by the number of people in the labor force. And if we extrapolate that out, it's the number of unemployed people divided by, again, the labor force is the number of employed plus the number of unemployed. Now you'll notice in our problem we have some distractor information. There are 75 people, that's true, but actually only 50 of them, 40 of the employed, and 10 of the unemployed actually matter to us, because remember, the unemployment rate only counts the employed and the unemployed. So those last two categories, the retired people and the discouraged workers, they're neither employed or unemployed, so we're not going to count them. So as we do our formula, we'll find that the number of unemployed is 10 divided by the number of unemployed plus employed, 10 plus 40, times 100% equals 0.2 times 100%, which equals 20%. Lastly, it's worth just mentioning there are a few criticisms of the unemployment rate, and some of them I suppose are obvious. First, part-time workers are counted as full-time workers. We know that's not ultimately really the objective of the economy. If somebody wants to work full-time, it's obviously not efficient if they're only working part-time. But right now they're counted the same in our unemployment rate. It also doesn't really take into account underemployment. Obviously, we want people to use their skills to the absolute maximum possibility. But as long as they have any job at all, they are considered employed, and there's no real correction made for that. And then, of course, maybe one of the biggest ones is it doesn't count discouraged workers, workers who we really should actually be out there working and who really do want to work but have become frustrated and don't have the option to have a job and have stopped looking for a job. And just some interesting information here, if you take a total look at this situation here, you'll notice that over the years, and we'll just pick one time, October of 2013, you'll notice that there were 91 million people in our country who were not in the labor force. That's nearly a third of our country is not a part of the labor force. And you can see all sorts of reasons and categories as to why each of those is. And if you'd like to stop the video and look at this data, it's interesting. But particularly, you can see the largest chunk is what you would expect. People who don't want a job. 85 million people, 85,780,000. But if you slide down here a little bit, you'll notice that there is this category right here, discouraged about work. And right there you see a pretty large chunk, 815,000 people are unemployed simply because they are not they don't have enough encouragement in the possibility of getting a job, and they've essentially given up working. That's an interesting fact and something that economists would like perhaps to have some more consideration in the unemployment rate. But this is just some interesting data that you can look over at your own leisure.